Welcome to Functional Philosophy. I'm Charles Tew. That's T as in tango, E as in echo, and W as in whiskey. This is episode number 4, and its title is Evil Without Mustache-Twirling. Many people find that they hold two irreconcilable beliefs about their hated ideological enemies. One of these beliefs is that the enemy is too consistently wrong to simply be mistaken. His wrongness being a moral failing is what elicits the hatred, after all. The other belief is that intentional evil doesn't exist. No one sets out to do evil. The people who make up the enemy can't really be indifferent to injustice and have the destruction of the country or the world as their goal, even if their policies seem perfectly designed to achieve those ends. They can't be so stupid as to not know what they're doing, but that would make them knowingly evil, and that seems psychologically impossible. So what's going on? Well, let's take Barack Obama as an example. I'm using him as my example because I hate him, but he also has the advantage of being the former president, and therefore an example all of you will be familiar with. You can substitute Donald Trump or whoever you like, or rather don't like, in your own mind. So, on the one hand, some people think, Obama can't possibly honestly believe, for instance, that government spending as such produces economic growth. That putting money in the hands of government bureaucrats creates more wealth than leaving it in the hands of private investors. The countervailing evidence and logic, they think, are so overwhelming that he must have been deliberately making us poorer and destroying the country. Maybe some guy on the street could have this mistaken belief about economics, but someone whose job involves understanding economics couldn't be this honestly ignorant. Obama was one of our most intellectual politicians, after all. He couldn't have done the studying and thinking, and ended up where he did on that issue. On the other hand, they think, mustache-twirling villains don't exist. Obama didn't look in the mirror on the day he decided to run for president and say, let's get this campaign for evil started. So, was he evil, or was he stupid? The answer isn't neither. It's both. He was evil so that he could be stupid enough to be psychologically capable of pursuing the policies he did. Now, I'm going to explain how this is done. Imagine you want to buy a car. You know how much you make each month, and you know how much your bills are each month. You can do the math to figure out the kind of car you can afford, but not in your head. Now, I'm going to give you the conventional account of how this goes, and then the true account. The conventional account. You do the calculations and buy the car you can afford, even if it's not the one you really wanted. You know you can and should do the calculations, and once you do them, you know you can't afford anything more, so you irresistibly acknowledge reality and buy what you can actually afford. What else are you going to do? Think to yourself, I'm going to wreck my expenses and risk homelessness. No, but that's what would be required to act immorally and buy the car you can't afford. And no one thinks to himself, I'm going to do wrong. So all cases of spending more than one can afford must be due to ignorance. In this case, you know what you should do, and so you do it. There's no such thing as should have known better on this view. If we're to believe in Plato's depiction of Socrates, Socrates endorsed this view. His reasoning was most people's when they conclude that no one intentionally does evil. And it's that it is absurd to think that anyone can have in mind that an action is wrong and yet do it anyway. If it were wrong, why would he do it? Now, this would have been much more convincing to Socrates than to people today. It has a logic to it that's still inescapable, but people don't think of logic as absolute, first of all, And more than that, they're altruists. They see an obvious possible motivation for doing evil. Evil is selfish, and that is also self-evidently something you would do. Why would any self do anything that isn't selfish? So you have the moral thing, which seems self-evidently to be what you ought to do, but also the selfish thing, which also seems self-evidently to be what you ought to do. That's the modern viewpoint. This dilemma would not have had the same force for a Greek like Socrates, as the Greeks were egoists, and didn't see any contradiction between the moral and the self-interested. That aside, the avowed evildoer, the mustache-twirler, still seems an impossible fantasy to people today. Since no one like that exists, they conclude, evil is a myth, an invalid concept based on a false distinction between mistake and malice. In reality, they believe, evil is just a name for a kind of ignorance that causes people to harm others through subsurface mechanisms which the superstitious identify as free will. I'll save an explicit discussion of free will for another episode. Let's get to the true account of the car buyer. The true account is that you could go either way. You could acknowledge reality and act morally and responsibly and buy only what you could afford, but that course of action isn't irresistible, even though you know it's right. A certain kind of person will experience trepidation at the thought of finding out how much he can afford. He may evade the fact that he should calculate what he can afford, and then guiltily buy the car he wanted without knowing if he can afford it. What the conventional Socratic account misses is that people don't have to keep in mind what they know. It's possible to evade, to switch your focus, to shut out what you know you should do, so that you can do what you feel like doing instead. You can indulge your emotions and spend money you're not sure you have. Think about the choices you make every day. Are you irresistibly pulled along according to what you know you should be doing? Have you possibly ever shoved your rational judgment aside by focusing on the urge you felt instead? Have you ever played video games when you knew you should be studying? Even if you haven't, you'll be able to see that you face that battle all the time, and it's possible to give in to temptation through evasion. Even if you did the calculations and figured out what kind of car you could afford, you could evade that knowledge so as to become psychologically capable of buying a car you knew you couldn't afford. The problem is that it's harder to avoid focusing on an item of knowledge than it is to avoid gaining that item of knowledge. Once you have it, you can't make yourself believe it's untrue. Faith doesn't exist in the way people think it does. No one is capable of believing something without or contrary to evidence. Your mind has a nature, an identity. It works in a certain way. Just as you can't force yourself to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, George Orwell's 1984 notwithstanding, so you can't force yourself to believe that anything that you know is true is false. What's actually going on when someone acts on faith is evasion of knowledge so as to become capable of acting on what one doesn't actually believe. You can't choose to disbelieve a conclusion you've reached. All you can do is ignore it, or you could have chosen to avoid the evidence or thought necessary to reach the conclusion in the first place. So, a better solution for the evader is to evade the evidence and thought that will result in inconvenient knowledge. If he does, he can honestly claim not to know if what he fears is true. You could maintain that you might have enough money to buy the car you want, and as long as you don't calculate your income and expenditures, you really do have that status of ignorance. In fact, if you're bad at estimating, you may even be able to honestly believe that you likely do have enough money for the car, even if you don't. Once you do the math, however, there's no going back, and evasion becomes costlier psychologically, because you've reached a certainty regarding the question your action is supposed to turn on. If you refuse to ever do the math, you're free to say you honestly don't know the solution, and even to believe that the solution might be good news. So, what Obama does, to go back to him, is avoid thinking about economic or political ideas he doesn't like. That way, he can always believe himself when he says that what he's doing might work. So, to say that Obama is evil and honest is not a contradiction. His immoral evasion is what allows him to honestly believe that certain things are possible. He doesn't think about the logical implications of what he's doing, so he never has to confront in explicit terms that what he's doing is destroying the world. In other words, he is dishonestly holding on to the status of someone who can honestly say he's making a mistake. That doesn't mean Obama isn't honestly making a mistake, but it does mean that he's being immoral by maintaining ignorance intentionally. The ignorance, the mistake, is real, but he knew he was putting himself in a position to make it. That desire to do what you want without having to know that it's wrong perpetuates and is perpetuated by the philosophy of skepticism. Bad philosophical ideas serve as rationalizations for evil, and that's the form in which they have their influence. The reason philosophy rules the world is that it legitimizes or delegitimizes certain motivations, certain psychological actions. In a rational world, reason is encouraged and faith is discouraged. In an irrational, skeptical world, philosophy acts to encourage bad behavior, like the type I've been discussing. Skepticism encourages faith. It makes all the difference whether someone like Obama can say, "I'm okay avoiding those ideas I don't like. Even if I look at them, I can never be sure I didn't make a mistake in investigating them. I can never claim certainty about anything anyway, so what difference does it make if I fudge things in my direction? What difference does it make if I act on faith that the ideas I want to be true are true?" So it's true that no one says, "I'm going to do evil." But the method by which he makes himself believe that the evil he's doing isn't evil is evil. And however much he tries to evade that he evaded, he knows somewhere in his mind that he has evaded, and his subconscious won't and can't let it go. I'm going to end with this lyric from a song I like by Find Faulting. "The evil on your mind, it pays you back in kind." If you have any questions about today's episode, you can send me an email at charles.a.tew, that's TEW, @gmail.com. Once this initial run of episodes ends, I'll start having a Q&A period in the back half of each episode, so you can start sending in questions now if you want. You can also visit my website at charlestew.com. There you'll find information on and links to everything I do, including ways to support my work. The main way you can support my work is through Patreon at patreon.com/charlestew. You can also leave reviews for Functional Philosophy wherever you happen to listen to it, such as iTunes. I appreciate your doing any of these things. Money helps so I can work on the show instead of another job, and reviews help in getting the show a bigger audience, and more supporters. Thanks for listening. Let's meet again in episode 5.